I'm Andrew Moran, Liberty Nation's economics editor.
Very, very rocky.
Death by government.
Drain the swamp.
Hello and welcome to another installment of Liberty Nation's Swamponomics videocast. I'm Andrew Moran, Liberty Nation's economics editor. This week, the federal government's budget is spiraling out of control. Quite surprising. That is according to the numbers, charts, and explanations coming from the Congressional Budget Office, or CBO, the nonpartisan budget watchdog. The chief headline coming out of the updated 2024 to 2034 economic and budget outlook was that the current fiscal year's federal deficit was revised higher from $1.5 trillion to $1.9 trillion. The cause? According to the CBO, the government has enacted some new legislation since the February estimates. This includes $145 billion for student loan forgiveness, $95 billion for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan, a $50 billion increase in Medicaid spending, and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation's $70 billion in deposit insurance. What's more, the CBO says without the surge of immigration, the deficit would far exceed $2 trillion. In total, federal spending is projected to be $6.8 trillion, and revenues are forecast to be $4.9 trillion. The debt held by the public will account for 99% of the gross domestic product. But this is not even the tip of the iceberg. By the time the United States flips to the 2034 calendar year, Washington policymakers will face a $2.8 trillion deficit. In this 10-year span, cumulative deficits would surpass $22 trillion. The national debt? Well, here is an unfathomable number. $50 trillion, which will represent more than 122% of the gross domestic product. These are astronomical numbers. The situation is spiraling out of control because of the spending, contrary to what the left is arguing. First, the US government will register a $10 trillion yearly budget beginning in 2034. Second, Washington will record an annual $1 trillion in net interest payments beginning next year. They will then climb to $1.7 trillion by 2034 and represent about 1/6 of all federal spending. Cumulative interest payments will total more than $13 trillion. Third, federal revenues will top $5 trillion in 2025 and exceed $7.4 trillion by 2034. We'll touch more on the revenues in a moment. Another interesting tidbit of information that you will likely not find anywhere else in the media: the Federal Reserve's payments to the US Treasury. The CBO does not believe they will resume sizable payments until 2030. As for the US economy, the CBO expects growth to slow below 2% in 2025 and in the subsequent years. Inflation will not touch 2% until 2026. The labor market will cool off, with the unemployment rate averaging above 4% in the coming decade. Now, it is important to note that these numbers are all based on rosy projections, meaning the US will not face a recession, a financial crisis, a pandemic, or a new war. After the CBO numbers were published, the political response was fast and furious. The White House immediately claimed that the CBO report confirms that former President Donald Trump's tax cuts submerged the United States in an ocean of red ink. So, there are a few things to touch upon the subject here. First, the CBO warned that extending the tax cuts would add a net $3.3 trillion to federal deficits over the next decade. Second, the CBO recently revised its revenue forecast relating to the Trump-era tax cuts. When the legislation was enacted in 2018, the CBO forecast tax receipts would fall by more than $1 trillion between 2018 and 2027. However, in an updated projection, revenues are expected to be roughly $600 billion higher for the 9-year span after adjusting for inflation. Finally, the latest CBO report assumes that the Trump-era tax cuts will expire. Therefore, it would be assumed that federal revenues would hop on a SpaceX rocket to outer space. Well, not quite. The CBO says, quote, after 2027, revenues change little as a percentage of GDP. So, did these tax cuts fuel the debt and deficits? Not really. A quick glance at federal tax receipts since 2018 shows that revenue soared 33%. So, what did cause the mountain of IOUs? Spending. Since 2018, outlays spiked 49%. How could a government run a deficit and increase the national debt if, should the CBO projections become accurate, politicians are receiving $7.5 trillion a year? President Joe Biden, his administration, and Democratic lawmakers have proposed various new tax schemes and tax hikes to fund lavish welfare and warfare endeavors. Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts recently appeared on CNBC and was asked if she would support earmarking certain tax revenues to help pay down the debt. Her answer? Nah. Instead, taxpayers should worry about a bridge to Cape Cod, a place where median home prices far exceed the national average. Here is a brief clip.
Yes, we need to bring down the national debt. We also need to make investments. We need to do both of those things. And we can't do it if we're letting people like Jeff Bezos say, you know what? He can take trips into outer space. He can buy the biggest yacht in the world. But somehow he doesn't have any W-2 income. And therefore, he doesn't really have to pay, at a higher tax rate than a Boston public school teacher.
Social Security is running out of money. Interest charges are now the second or third largest budgetary item. Foreign conflicts are stretching America thin. The federal government is facing $200 trillion in unfunded liabilities and expenditures. It's tough out there. There won't be any bridges if the nation's capital can only afford mandatory spending and keeping the lights on in Congress. That's it from this week. Please read my full Swamponomics column on the pages of LibertyNation.com, and be sure to check out my previous Swamponomics TV videos and interviews. Thank you. I'm Andrew Moran, Liberty Nation's economics editor.
Very, very rocky.
Death by government.
Drain the swamp.